a lot of the districts in Grants Pass, so Grants Pass School District, as well as Three Rivers. We do a lot of programming in Ashland, as well as Phoenix Talent, which was actually one of our longest school communities that we were serving. So yeah, we'll just kind of dive in. This is going to be a very broad overview of what restorative justice is, more generally. So just kind of developing a common understanding of restorative justice, as well as looking at what are some of the fundamental principles and some of the needs that restorative justice work meets within schools, but also outside of schools as well. And I'll speak about that a little bit more as we go on. And then we're just going to touch on, possibly if there's time, a little bit more about the work that we do in the Valley. There might not be time though. We'll see. Can you go to the, thank you. So this is just a moment for self-reflection. I should have asked this sooner, but does everybody have something on hand that you could jot some notes down with, a pen, paper, something like that? Can't see everyone's response. So I want us just to, before I feed you a definition of the term restorative justice, I invite you just to take maybe 2 minutes and think for yourself what this phrase means to you, restorative justice. What, using whatever information you have at your disposal currently, what does restorative justice mean for you personally? And don't worry about the second question regarding implementing. We'll touch on that later. How's everybody feeling on that? Good. Okay, I see some thumbs. All right. Great. So if we could, would people be willing to offer just what came to them when they were thinking about this term? And if you want, oh, go ahead, please. Thank you. All right, so there are a couple different definitions of restorative justice that I've noted here. Restorative justice is a systems change model grounded in equity, responsibility, care, connection, and community. There are restorative values and practices which emphasize that to take meaningful restorative action, we must shift our beliefs surrounding harm, punishment, and healing. It can also be noted that restorative justice can be applied in a variety of settings, really in all aspects of our life. These are more of the institutional kind of frames that are highlighted in this definition, but really restorative justice is a way of relating, both first to ourselves and then to one another. And it is a way of living, really. And so this systems change idea is really founded on us first looking deeply at ourselves and then being able to look at the way that we are in relationship with one another. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, and I'll show you why that is important as we continue. All right. So these are some of the key restorative justice principles. If you're to do a Google search and you're, curious, what are the fundamental values or principles of restorative justice as a practice or as a systems change model, these are probably some of the key terms that you are going to find. I want to note a caveat here because these words might not be your restorative justice principles, and they might not reflect the restorative justice principles among a group of people that you might be working with. And so whenever I, as a practitioner, facilitator, I work with a group of people, I always ask them, what are the values that bring them to this place, to this training, to this conversation? And I allow those values to inform what the core principles are within that particular context. And so, accountability, individuals are encouraged to take responsibility for actions and understand the impact of their behavior. Repair, emphasis is placed on the need to make amends for harm caused or impact caused. And this can include a wide range of things. Sometimes just a conversation is enough. And there's a lot of learning that can be had through acknowledgement and us gaining a deeper understanding of the motivations of why somebody makes the choices that they make. And so sometimes having a restorative dialogue can be plenty. However, in other cases, depending on the harm and depending on what the person who has been impacted needs, there might be restitution involved, community service, or other forms of making amends. And then healing is another core principle, and it aims to heal, again, through acknowledgement, sharing impacts, gaining that deeper understanding, and really being able to honor the dignity and humanity of people who have perhaps harmed one another, or perhaps one person has been more impacted than another. Inclusion, the practice of restorative justice, it includes all stakeholders, victims, offenders, community members are involved in the process. It's collaborative and it helps to rebuild trust and foster community. And lastly, transformation. I personally feel that there is an opportunity for deep transformation whenever we reframe the way that we think about harm, how we approach harm, how we handle harm in our communities whenever it does occur. And I think that when we focus more on the needs of those that are impacted and the way that somebody can move forward and make some repair, it not only keeps people in our community, but it creates an opportunity for learning, which I think is one of the most intrinsic values in bringing this into our educational systems. Another thing that I wanted to mention before I continue about the principles is that often we will set agreements whenever we come into a space together, like a circle together, a conversation together. We'll have a shared understanding of what our guidelines are of conduct. And so sometimes we do have to break words down, and that principles, those definitions of the principles are an example, because accountability, for one, can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Even the word harm. When we work with 5th and 6th graders in our Choice Point program, we find that youth have a radically different definition of what harm means between two people. So I want to touch on the punitive or more traditional model and approach of dealing with harm versus a restorative model. And I'm going to highlight the nuance by looking at the way that we think about answering these questions. So in a punitive model, and I think that a lot of us could see this as an example in our discipline matrices within schools, it essentially looks at, what rule has been broken and who was the person that broke that rule. And then you go across a grid and you see what is the punishment that is the equivalent, what do they deserve punishment-wise for that behavior. Oftentimes there is not a lot of focus or care in terms of supporting the accountability of that person when it comes to the other individuals that have been impacted or harmed. And So it's not, in this way, the punitive structure is not necessarily lending itself to the learning to take responsibility for our choice, and then also identifying how can we move forward from this choice, knowing that we don't have to allow it to define us. However, how can we all move forward, and what do we all need to be able to move forward together? It doesn't mean that people are always buddy-buddy after harm happens, but it does mean that everybody's needs are met so that they can have closure to the event and move forward with peace and they're more in balance. And the restorative model asks some questions like, who has been impacted? That's the first question versus, what has even happened? That is a really important piece to know, but really focusing on like, who are the most impacted individuals? Is this a big community impact, etc.? And what are they going to need? Who is obligated to repair that harm? And what is that best process? Okay, go ahead. These are some of the limitations of a more punitive approach. It tends to largely be offender or person who caused harm centric, where most energy is really being sent toward the individual or individuals who have been engaged in some kind of misconduct that had a really big impact around them, or maybe a small impact, doesn't have to be really big. Often, because there is not an opportunity for people to come together and discuss and to be heard, it leads itself towards certain cognitive biases, or kind of think about them as, well, like blaming others for what happened, blaming the system, blaming the teacher, blaming, the principal, etc. This feeling of being victimized, maybe marginalizing what's happened, etc. However, whenever we take a restorative approach, then we have an opportunity to um, really work with individuals to understand in a non-shaming way that these ways of thinking that are mostly to protect ourselves because we're afraid of getting in trouble, they're not necessary, and they're actually blocking us from being able to move forward, and to figure out like, how can we make repair? Often, a punitive approach, it does not actually address the root cause of behavior. And I think that that's a huge one to note, especially working with youth, especially in schools. A youth may show up, maybe they haven't had breakfast, maybe they went to bed at 2 a.m., maybe they're going through some really big things outside of school. Maybe they've been getting bullied for the past 6 months by somebody. When we are looking exclusively at a misbehavior, then we miss the opportunity to really support the person who caused the harm as well and getting their needs met. And so a restorative approach creates an opportunity for that to happen through dialogues and conversation. I'll run through these last ones pretty quickly. Perpetuates a cycle of harm, largely because it's not trauma-informed. It will often perpetuate shame and stigmatization. And yes, and then we have the school to prison pipeline. And I think that that is mostly focusing on really high rates of suspension and removing youth from the community with the expectation that that behavior is going to change when they come back. And oftentimes that's not what ends up happening. And over the years, we've seen alarming numbers in the increase of juveniles within our system, especially younger youth in the system. All right, we can continue. So when I say it's a systems change model, I'm trying to go through a lot of information here. And I hope that it's all like I'm connecting the dots. So please, like, if you have questions as they come up, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Because I do know that I'm bouncing around quite a bit and I'm talking about something that at this moment might feel really theoretical. depending on where you're coming from, what your exposure's been. So there are 3 different tiers in terms of restorative circles or restorative practices. And this is one facet of a tool or a set of tools that are used within the restorative justice. We think about it as an umbrella. Circles are a tool. And these circles are not new. Restorative justice is not a new practice. It is rooted in Indigenous practices. And this way of relating, both in establishing and furthering community and handling harm within a community that keeps people in the community instead of sending them out, I mean, it has been practiced for thousands of years. So I also want to acknowledge that. So at the base, we have community building circles. Are any of you running community building circles right now in your educational spaces? Okay. So this is really foundational, and this is not dealing with harm. And we offer quite a few trainings throughout the year on how to integrate community building circles into classrooms. So if you're interested in this, I encourage you to reach out. But this is really for the purpose of developing social and emotional capacities within people, youth, adults, etc. It works brilliantly for everybody. This is 80% of the work of restorative justice is building a culture of care and connection. And the way that we personally do that is through community building circles. So prioritizing people coming together in a circle, everybody having an opportunity to share something. And just getting to know each other, getting to understand a little bit more about one another outside of the context of a traditionally structured classroom where there's one teacher who's doing most of the talking. In a circle, it's intentional in that everybody has that intentional opportunity to share. And one thing I love about circles that we don't often get in our office spaces or our classrooms is that we can see every single person's eyes in a circle. And so it's once you find yourself in that type of configuration with folks, it can be quite vulnerable, just because you can see everybody's face. The impromptu dialogues, restorative conferences, and responsive circles, those are a tier 2, and we do start breaking into working with impacts and harms at that tier. And that's managing repetitive difficulties and disruptions. I would also say that impromptu dialogues can be used just to handle, even if it hasn't been repetitious, it's still a great technique to use in the moment. And that'll be about 15%. And then repairing more serious harms, those are reentry circles, restorative conferences, victim offender dialogues. And yeah. All right, let's continue. How are we on time? Let's see, we're at 4 o'clock. I have a video that I would really like to share with all of you because I think it does a really beautiful way of showing a little bit more through story what I'm talking about. It's 18 minutes long. We can cut it a little sooner if we need to, but how are folks feeling about that? Would you like to? Pretty good? Okay, let's do it. And I do want to offer a small trigger warning. This woman does, not small, I want to offer a trigger warning. This woman does share about a murder that happened to her very close family member. And she doesn't go into any kind of detail, but I just want to let you know that that is part of this discussion.
I just want to stand here for a second and bask in Shane's wake. Here's the thing. In life, stuff is going to happen. Thankfully, lots of good stuff, but sometimes bad stuff. And I believe because we share this beautiful earth of ours, by living in community, that when we come across a mess, we have a moral responsibility to roll up our sleeves and to get busy and to clean that mess up. Sometimes in the process of cleaning up a mess, we're going to realize we're standing right beside the person that caused it. And it's in that moment that I think there exists an enormous amount of power and possibility. I have two stories to share with you today. One about a tiny mess and one about an enormous mess. And I want to share with you what I think they have to do with education.
I can't believe I'm getting married today. That tailor at Men's Warehouse made me look amazing. I got a 3-piece suit, new shoes, a nice watch, and whoops, I was supposed to be at the chapel 2 hours ago.
Sorry.
My father was a naval commander, kind, gentle man. He was an engineer by training, which meant he loved to find the most efficient way to solve a problem. While I'm sure he saw his share of conflict through the wars, at home he was a true peacemaker. He seemed to spend an inordinate amount of time trying to restore order to our chaotic dining table. He didn't ask a lot of us as a family, but the one request that my father made was that none of us use his beard trimming scissors. I had 2 older brothers and an older sister, and they had desks of their own filled with supplies, and my mother had her own sewing room. So scissors weren't a particular novelty to them. But for me at 7, I was fascinated with the fact that my father would have something that only he was allowed to use. And I remember watching him meticulously shaping his beard with these scissors. They were tiny, they were sharp, and they were very, very pointy. So one day, I was doing a little craft project, which involved an enormous amount of paper, a huge amount of glue, and a few staples. And I decided that I needed to cut something. So I went into the bathroom, and I took my father's scissors. They were amazing. Until, of course, I cut through a big glob of wet glue and a couple of staples. And I realized that I had damaged my father's scissors. So, as stealthily as I had taken them out of the medicine cabinet, I put them back. The next day, my father came to me, and he crouched down to eye level, and he looked at me and he said, "Did you use my scissors?" And I lied. And then my father told me how disappointed he was in me. And he proceeded to show me how the scissors no longer easily cut his beard. They snagged and pulled at the hair painfully. And he asked me again, "Did you use my scissors?" And this time I told him I had. So my father took me for a walk in the garden, and he didn't say much for a while. And then he started to talk to me about honesty and about respecting people's property, and most importantly, about respecting their feelings. We came in the house, and he showed me how to clean the dried glue off the blades with rubbing alcohol, and how to finally sand the nick out with sandpaper. And then he made us 2 huge cups of hot chocolate with lots of marshmallows. And we never talked about the scissor incident again. Years later, when I had children of my own, I was grappling with finding a discipline technique that felt like it fit. Most of my friends were using the timeout. But you know, it seemed counterintuitive to me. And also, with toddler twins, it seemed almost impossible to manage 2 children in 2 different spaces. And also, it seemed like the child who was most affected by a transgression ended up being the one that got the least amount of attention. So I thought back to the way that I was raised, and I realized that in my family, it had really been much more about the time in. When something went wrong, my parents would sit down with us, and they'd take the time to explain how our behavior was impacting the family, and then they would help us figure out a way to make things better. So my husband Bob and I adopted the time-in method with our children, and that was the way we raised them. And I'm sure initially a lot of the language went over their little heads to begin with. But ultimately what it did was it set up an opportunity for my children to realize that what our default position was going to be to come together, to talk about behavior, to talk about feelings, and to talk about the impact that our actions have on the people that we care about. 2 weeks before my children's 5th birthday, I found myself standing in the emergency room of the local hospital, watching a doctor with the defibrillator paddles in his hand, desperately trying to resuscitate my husband. Just an hour before, he and 2 friends had left our quiet New Year's party to go check on the home of a vacationing neighbor whose son had decided to host a party of his own. Something had gone wrong. Police officers started to fill that emergency room, and I stood there looking at the doctors, the nurses, the EMTs, those officers, and I realized every one of them was just desperately clinging to everything they had been trained to do as professionals when the most unthinkable of situations begins to unfold. But I also understood for them that at some moment, their shift was going to end and they were going to get to go home. But you see, I wasn't at work. My shift was never going to end. And I realized standing there in the middle of all that chaos that somehow I was going to have to find a way to live with whatever had just happened. And more importantly, to move forward in my life in a positive way. I left my dead 40-year-old husband at the hospital, and I went home to wait for my children to wake up so I could tell them that their daddy was dead. I looked for the plainest words I could, and I crouched down to their level, and I explained to them. And after a long pause, my little boy looked at me and he said, "Can I have some Cheerios?" Of course, because that's what happens. Children wake up and they're hungry. And after they eat, they play because that's their job. They spend time outside, and then maybe after a meal, somebody will help them with a bath, tuck them into bed, read them a story, they go to sleep. They wake up the next day and they do it all over again. Day after day after day. And usually one of the people that makes that come together for a child is their mother. And that was my job. And I realized that I couldn't make their little lives be all about my husband's death. So I made them a promise. I promised them that underneath the horror of what had just happened to our family, we would find a gift and perhaps one day an opportunity to share that gift. Autopsy results revealed that Bob had died from multiple kicks to the head. But the information really stopped there. A code of silence descended over the small community we lived in. None of the 200 young people that were at that party gave the police the information that they needed to move forward with their investigation. The media were on my doorstep immediately, shoving a microphone in my face, saying, "What do you want to see happen to the person that did this?" I thought I would throw up. My children had just lost their father. I didn't want them to lose me in the process. If I had responded, frankly, the way society expected me to, filled with hatred, filled with vengeance, what kind of person, what kind of parent was I going to become? Absolutely, I wanted answers. Absolutely, I wanted somebody to be accountable. But I also wanted to know that my children were going to be okay, that my community was going to be okay. And that included whoever was on the other side of this horrible tragedy. It was 5 years before Ryan Aldridge was arrested and charged in connection with my husband's death. The police called to tell me they were ready to make the arrest, and I told them I was on my way. What are you talking about? Why would you want to meet the person that killed your husband? Leave that to the police, to the system. I said, I need to sit down with him. I need to speak to him face to face. I need to understand what was going on in his life to make him capable of doing what he did. I need him to understand what's been going on in our lives. I needed time in. 16 hours after Ryan was arrested, I was back in that community, sitting in a small interrogation room, about to meet the young man that killed my husband. I thought my heart would come out my mouth. I expected some kind of monster to walk through the door, not a young man that could be my son, your son, somebody's best friend. He sat across from me, slumped over, sobbing. I handed him ball after ball of tissue, and it was all I could do not to get out of my seat, to cross over the other side of the room, and to give him a hug. Because he looked like that was what he needed more than just about anything. We didn't say a whole lot to each other when we first met, but I told him his confession was the first step in the right direction, and the next step I urged him to consider would be pleading guilty, so that neither of our families would have to endure a trial. As soon as Ryan went to jail, I worried about him. I had no idea what was going to happen behind bars to support his rehabilitation. So I began to educate myself about that end of the system. And it was then that I learned about the powerful model of restorative justice. Now, our conventional system you're all familiar with. It asks the question, what law was broken? Who broke that law? And what's the punishment going to be? But it pays little attention to the needs of the victim or the community. The restorative model, on the other hand, works on the assumption that when harm happens in our community, it is a violation of relationship. And the questions are slightly different. We want to know, what happened? Who's been affected? And what are we going to do to make things right? Ryan served 3 out of 5 years of his sentence. And during that time, we did a properly facilitated restorative process called a victim offender mediation. I spent an entire day in jail with Ryan. When I hear the political rhetoric about getting tough on crime, man, that's what we did that day. We got tough on crime. Lots of tears, lots of long silences where neither of us could find the words, but ultimately it was an opportunity for us to find some humanity around a situation that to this point had been anything but humane. I don't think that Ryan went out that day with the intention of killing somebody, but what I understand now is that he made a series of poor choices throughout his adolescence and teen years that culminated in a fatal one that brought our lives together. Ryan had been a small child. He had a speech impediment. He was picked on and bullied in school. When his parents divorced, he didn't know where he belonged. When he lost a friend in a drinking driving crash, he didn't understand that getting drunk and putting your fist through the wall does not qualify as grieving. The more time we spent together, the more that we realized we had things in common, because that is what happens when you share space with someone. We talked about the things that mattered to us, our families, a love of the outdoors. We discovered we had a mutual interest in art. He went to his cell. He brought his sketchbook back to show me his drawings. I brought my laptop. I showed him the presentation that I developed for youth around social responsibility. And I said to him, it's a powerful message, but it occurs to me that it's only half the story. Perhaps you'd like to share it with me. And after he got out of jail, Ryan and I worked together for a number of years, sharing our story with thousands of kids in BC. But we don't work together anymore for what I like to think are all the right reasons. Because Ryan's finished his sentence, he's moved on with his life. He's employed. He just got married. I found out last week they're expecting a family. The fact that Ryan seems incapable now of inflicting any further harm is the gift that I was looking for.
Okay, we're gonna go ahead and pause it there.
Yes, thank you so much, Shelby. And so what she continues to, just to kind of give you an understanding of how that closes, um, she connects it back to education in that she asks the question, what if Ryan or people that find themselves in similar situations had their opportunity as they were going through their educational experience to have restorative processes throughout their lives? Would that outcome have been different for him in his life if he had been held to integrity in a different kind of way whenever he was acting out in like ways that were harmful to himself and to others? And so she kind of leaves the conversation with that lingering question at the end. And she does have some caveats in there as well to tie it back. But I want to hear from all of you at this point, just kind of one, what stood out to you during her talk? And thinking she speaks a lot about the carceral system, but I'm curious if you can consider how you think something like this would play out in your school community. If you know of ways that restorative work is already happening in your school communities. Maybe you don't call it restorative justice. But yeah, I'd just like to hear from you, your general thoughts on what she was sharing. Before we part ways, I wanted to touch on impromptu dialogues because this is something that I think teachers specifically will use most often in their classrooms. We won't necessarily always see the opportunity for a restorative conference or a restorative dialogue, but these one-on-one impromptu dialogues, I mean, really, we can practice them anywhere in our lives. We can, with our children, with our partners, with our friends, our coworkers. These are tools that can be, if you practice them and you become quite effective, they're really supportive in helping to navigate situations of conflict. Um, so, starting with one of the most important aspects of restorative justice is being able to maintain a level of curiosity. So, I know for myself, at various times in my life, I have come to a situation assuming that I know what happened. Actually, I do this with my children all the time. I will hear them arguing in the next room, and I will assume, based on what I'm loosely hearing, but I'm not seeing, um, who is in the wrong and who is in the quote unquote right. And instead of going to them and asking them each individually, okay, what happened? What's your side of the story? And then going to the other and being like, what happened for you? I sometimes jump to assumptions. And so it's really important for me and for all of us as we embark in restorative justice work is to always maintain a level of curiosity. And one way that we do that is to practice asking open-ended questions. And kind of a trick that I think, because asking open-ended questions is actually quite challenging to do consistently. We often frame questions to a yes or no response. So one way I remember to do that is to ask who, what, when, where, how, why. And then it will be an open-ended question. So, and then practicing deep listening, active listening, and we'll kind of touch on that briefly. And then effective communication. All right. So some helpful things when you are practicing active listening is to first just ask an open-ended question and then just be quiet and just absorb what is being said. And then maybe when it comes to a pause, ask, say, this is what I'm understanding. Is this what you're saying? This is what I'm hearing. Is this what you mean? Because sometimes some of our biggest differences exist because of this miscommunication and what a person is hearing and what is actually being said. And so that's another way that we can also paraphrase what is happening. It also can be really effective to slow the story down that you're hearing. And I'll show you at the end some restorative questions that help to slow the process of storytelling down. And then whenever you're asking someone, so you would use this you could use this all the time, but we're speaking about it exclusively whenever something has occurred. So maybe a student threw a pencil at another student and you've asked them to go into the hall and you're coming out and you're going to check in with them about what happened because maybe the student got hit in the face with the pencil and they were pretty upset about it. Okay, go ahead. So in that moment, we'll just kind of keep running with the pencil story. I might say, when I saw you throw that pencil at Bob, I felt really angry and I felt really frustrated. And I also felt worried because I thought that Bob maybe would get a pencil in the eye, and that could be a really serious concern for him, his family, etc. So what I'm going to ask you is, and then name your request. Maybe it's as simple as don't throw the pencil anymore, or maybe you want him to actually or her go to check in with the student that got hit with the pencil. You could, at that point, you could make the request. But this is an example of just an effective communication. You can use it with a coworker. When I saw XYZ, or when you send me an email that has this kind of tone, then I feel, It's just a really great way to very clearly state the elephant in the room. Or sometimes not the elephant in the room, something that's very obvious, but you need to be able to state what the harm is in order to be able to support accountability and responsibility for that decision to either throw the pencil or maybe not be so aware of the way that our emails might be conveyed, just as an example. So if I was having an issue with something that was happening, I would use this structure. And once you feel really comfortable with that, you can always deviate from it, make it your own. There's a lot around like, oh, these scripts, they're not authentic. Yes, they're kind of, and it's like you're going to find your own language and way to say this. And really, this is a tool as we start embarking on improving the way that we communicate when it comes to conflict. Because a lot of us really are either conflict avoidant or conflict aggressive. And so we might struggle to just really clearly name the thing that needs to be called out or called in rather, and find the way to move forward in a clear path without dragging maybe a bunch of other like opinions or judgments into the conversation that maybe don't need to be there for it to be effective. All right. So these are the restorative questions. So then I might ask this to one of the two students that was affected by that situation, like from your perspective, what happened? And after they share, what were you thinking or feeling when you made those choices or when that happened? Like, how did you think or feel? How are you feeling now? How are you doing now? And if somebody has affected others, you ask them, like, who do you think's been affected by this? And when I ask this question, I really like to help people stretch their brain. So I liked it whenever one of you had mentioned the ripple effect of harm or the ripple effect of an impact, that it didn't just affect the woman in the story and her children, the neighbors, the workers, the community. Oftentimes, our decisions have more substantial impacts than we even might be able to think of whenever we make a particular choice. So helping people, especially youth, understand that is really important, I think, in supporting people to step into responsibility. And then asking, like, what is the hardest part of all of this been for you? And then what do you think needs to happen to make things right? And you can use these. You don't have to be in a circle to use these whenever you're trying to navigate a sticky situation with somebody. This is something I would use just a face-to-face, one-to-one, or if I was helping two people try to navigate a sticky situation between them. All right. I think that's, oh, okay, sorry. And then lastly, why restorative justice? And this is just a list of some of the benefits that do